Welcome to my channel. And today I want to share a story that will take you on an emotional journey of faith, warning, and unexpected consequences. A story about a man who ignored signs meant to save his family, a woman whose prayers built an invisible shield, and a Christmas journey that turned into a life-changing turning point. So, sit back, open your heart, and let's start. 2 weeks before Christmas, the house of Michael Harris transformed into a place of constant noise and movement. The kind of joyful chaos that only children waiting for a holiday could create, as his kids ran up and down the hallway, laughing, shouting, and talking endlessly about their upcoming trip to the countryside. Completely unaware that something dark and unseen lay ahead of them, something that would change their lives forever. Because although this trip was a yearly tradition and the easiest, happiest time they spent with extended family, this year was different in ways none of them could imagine. Every Christmas, they traveled back to their rural hometown where fresh air filled the lungs, tall trees lined the dusty roads, and cousins waited with open arms, and the children loved it because it felt like freedom. But this time, fate was already moving quietly, watching and waiting. Michael's wife, Rebecca Harris, was busy as always, folding clothes neatly, packing bags, and preparing snacks days in advance because she believed preparation was a form of care and responsibility, making sure nothing was forgotten. Yet despite all her efforts, one thing continued to trouble her deeply, something she could not pack into a bag or solve with organization, because Michael never prayed, and as she folded another shirt into the suitcase, she finally spoke, asking softly if they could pray for just 2 minutes, but Michael waved his hand dismissively, as though swatting an insect, telling her to stop bothering him, laughing as he said that God already knew they were traveling and did not need reminders to protect them. And Rebecca felt a heaviness settle in her chest as she looked at her husband, shaking her head silently and wondering why he refused to understand the importance of faith. The children were no better, especially the older ones who had begun copying their father's behavior, and whenever Rebecca knelt in the morning to pray, they groaned and dragged their feet, complaining that praying every day was boring. Yet she never stopped, even when they made faces or complained, because she believed deeply in the power of prayer and constantly asked God to protect her family, though in her heart, she wished Michael would join her, even once. As excitement filled the house and the children talked endlessly about village games, family gatherings, and endless outdoor fun, Michael smiled at their joy, but Rebecca sat quietly studying her family, holding her breath and whispering a silent prayer, asking God to keep them safe. As Christmas drew closer, the family had no idea that something was waiting on the road ahead, something that would test their faith and change their lives permanently. One evening, Michael was driving home from work, his thoughts focused on the journey ahead, when he turned a corner and saw an elderly woman standing by the roadside waving for help, her clothes wrapped tightly around her waist and a small basket resting in her hands. And although he hesitated briefly, he slowed down and stopped, leaning out of the window to ask where she was going, and in a tired voice, she told him she was heading to the next street and asked if he could take her there. So Michael nodded and told her to get in. The woman climbed into the car quietly, and for a while they drove in silence, the hum of the engine and the sound of distant insects filling the air, until she cleared her throat and asked gently if he would not be offended by what she was about to say. And when Michael told her to speak, she took a deep breath and warned him that this Christmas he should not travel to his hometown. And if he insisted on going, he and his family must pray and fast before the journey, because danger lay ahead, and her words hung in the air like smoke. But Michael burst into loud laughter, shaking his head, as he told her that he traveled every Christmas and nothing ever happened, dismissing her warning as superstition. The woman's eyes grew intense as she replied that she had said what she needed to say, and the rest was up to him. And when they reached her destination and she stepped out of the car, she thanked him for the ride and repeated her warning, urging him to pray if he chose to go, but Michael waved her off with a smile, convincing himself she was only trying to sound wise or scare him. And as he drove away, he never noticed how she stood still watching the car disappear, her face unreadable. 2 days before Christmas, the house buzzed with excitement as bags were stacked by the door, filled with clothes, gifts, and snacks, and the children danced around the room. But before they left, Rebecca gathered everyone in the living room and asked them to pray, speaking calmly yet firmly. Only for Michael to frown and complain again about prayers, saying they were not going to the moon and telling her he needed to warm up the car, leaving her to kneel and pray alone with the children, whispering for God's protection. Outside, Michael turned the key in the ignition and waited, but instead of the engine starting, there was silence. And after trying again with no success, he muttered in frustration, opened the hood and stared at the engine helplessly. And when he went back inside to explain the problem, Rebecca calmly suggested that maybe God did not want them to go, which angered Michael, who snapped at her and called a mechanic. But when the mechanic arrived and inspected the car, he shook his head and explained that the engine had failed and the car was not going anywhere, leaving Michael shocked and confused because the car had worked perfectly the day before. Rebecca smiled faintly and said God knew why, but Michael mocked her words sarcastically, pacing the room angrily until he decided they would take a commercial bus instead, despite Rebecca's gentle protest that maybe they should not go at all. And with his decision made, the bags were repacked, and the children remained excited, while Rebecca's heart felt heavy, praying silently for God to take control. What Michael and his family did not know was that far away in the countryside, someone was watching and waiting. Because in the village, Margaret Collins, Michael's stepmother, sat outside her modest home, staring down the dusty road with bitterness burning inside her, thinking about how every Christmas Michael arrived like royalty with his bright car and happy family, while her own sons struggled and fueled by jealousy and resentment. She decided that this year would be different, calling her closest friend Ruth Collins and confiding her anger. And together they went deep into the forest to seek dark help, unaware that while evil plans were being made, prayers were already rising elsewhere, quietly building a shield no curse could fully break. And as the sun rose the next morning, Michael and his family headed toward the bus station, completely unaware that their journey had already become a battlefield between faith and darkness, and that this Christmas would never be forgotten. As the bus engine roared to life and slowly pulled away from the crowded station, Michael Harris leaned back in his seat, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach, while around him, vendors shouted their last offers. Passengers adjusted their bags, and the city slowly faded behind them. And although the children laughed and pointed excitedly out the windows at passing buildings and roadside scenes, Rebecca sat quietly with her hands folded, her lips moving silently in prayer, asking for protection not only for her family, but for everyone on the bus, because her spirit felt restless, as though something unseen was following them. Michael, embarrassed earlier by her public prayer, shook his head and told himself she worried too much, closing his eyes as the gentle rocking of the bus lulled him into a light sleep. Convinced that nothing could possibly go wrong, because he had traveled this road countless times before. Mile after mile passed peacefully, the road stretching ahead beneath the bright afternoon sky, until suddenly the calm was shattered by the driver's panicked shout that the brakes were not responding, and in an instant, screams filled the bus as it began swerving violently from side to side. Passengers clutching seats, bags falling, children crying, and Rebecca instinctively pulling her kids close, whispering prayers with every breath. While ahead of them, a massive fuel truck appeared, its size blocking the narrow road like an immovable wall. The driver fought desperately to regain control, sweat pouring down his face, but the bus sped forward uncontrollably, tires screeching, metal groaning, and in those terrifying seconds, time itself seemed to slow. And Rebecca's voice rose above the chaos as she cried out to God for mercy. And then, with a thunderous crash, the bus slammed into the truck, the sound echoing across the countryside as glass shattered and darkness swallowed everything. When silence finally fell, it was heavy and unnatural, broken only by distant groans and crackling metal, and rescue teams soon arrived, pulling survivors from the wreckage, discovering with amazement that Rebecca and her children were completely unharmed, not even scratched, as though an invisible shield had wrapped around them. But Michael was not as fortunate, because the impact had crushed his legs, leaving him alive but severely injured. He was rushed to the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Rebecca followed with tears streaming down her face, holding tightly to her children and thanking God that they were alive. News of the accident spread quickly, reaching the village before sunset, and when Margaret Collins heard the rumors, she collapsed dramatically, crying loudly for all to hear, pretending grief while inside she felt a twisted satisfaction, believing her plan had succeeded. unaware that the very prayers she had mocked through Michael would become the reason her plan failed. At the hospital, doctors worked through the night to save Michael's life, and by morning he was awake, weak, but breathing. And when the elderly woman he had picked up days earlier appeared at his bedside, her presence calm and commanding, she reminded him of her warning and revealed that dark plans had been made against him, but that his wife's prayers had protected the family. And as Michael looked at Rebecca, standing quietly nearby, tears filled his eyes as he realized how foolish he had been to ignore faith. He apologized through sobs, promising that if he survived, he would never mock prayer again. And true to his word, when he was eventually discharged from the hospital, changed forever physically and spiritually, he became a man devoted to prayer, leading his family every morning and thanking God openly for mercy, while Rebecca stood beside him, grateful but humbled. Back in the village, strange events began to unfold as Margaret Collins grew restless, plagued by guilt and fear, because instead of celebration, unease filled her home, and whispers spread among villagers that unseen consequences were approaching, signaling that evil intentions never go unanswered, and that while harm may be planned, faith can redirect even the darkest paths. In the days following the accident, life slowed into a strange new rhythm for Michael Harris and his family. As hospital corridors replaced busy highways and the steady beeping of machines replaced the laughter that once filled their home, and while Michael lay on his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to move his legs, his mind replayed every moment he had dismissed Rebecca's prayers, every laugh he had used to cover his disbelief, and every warning he had ignored. And now those memories cut deeper than his physical pain, because he could clearly see that faith was not weakness, but protection he had foolishly rejected. Rebecca remained by his side, day and night, gently feeding him, encouraging him, and praying quietly, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on her body. And the children, confused and frightened by their father's condition, clung to her, learning in their own innocent way that prayer was not boring but powerful, because it was the very reason they were alive. News of the accident continued to spread, and many people who had been on the bus visited the hospital to thank Rebecca for insisting on prayer, before the journey telling her how they believed something unseen had intervened, and each story strengthened Michael's conviction that he had been spared for a reason. Meanwhile, far away in the village, Margaret Collins began to experience deep unease, because instead of the peace she expected after hearing about the accident, she found herself unable to sleep, her nights filled with disturbing dreams of crashing metal and voices calling her name. And whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Michael's face, alive and breathing, which confused and angered her, because she had been told the plan would end his journey completely. Her friend Ruth tried to reassure her, but even she felt a growing fear, sensing that something had gone wrong, and villagers began whispering about strange occurrences around Margaret's home, such as sudden cold winds, flickering lamps, and unexplained noises which made her retreat indoors, haunted by the possibility that her actions had consequences she could no longer control. Back at the hospital, doctors informed Michael that he would never walk again, and although the news crushed him, he accepted it with surprising calm, saying quietly that if losing his legs was the price for his family's lives, he would gladly pay it. And that statement alone marked how deeply his heart had changed, because the man who once mocked prayer now thanked God openly for mercy, promising to live differently if given the chance. As weeks passed, Michael was discharged from the hospital and returned home in a wheelchair, greeted by neighbors who came bearing food, kind words, and curiosity. And although his body was weaker, his spirit was stronger than it had ever been, because every morning without fail, he gathered his family together to pray, his voice steady and sincere. And the children no longer complained but joined willingly, having witnessed firsthand what prayer could do. Rebecca watched her husband with quiet gratitude, knowing her patience and faith had not been in vain. And although life was harder now, it was also deeper and more meaningful, filled with gratitude rather than routine. Michael began sharing his story with anyone who would listen, warning others not to ignore spiritual guidance or mock faith, explaining how close his family came to tragedy and how prayer became their shield when all else failed. And his testimony spread beyond their neighborhood, reaching people who had never taken prayer seriously before. In the village, Margaret's situation worsened as guilt consumed her, because rumors eventually reached her that Michael had survived, and when she confirmed it was true, Panic seized her heart, and she confronted Ruth, demanding answers. But Ruth only shook her head in fear, admitting that they had interfered with things beyond their control. Margaret's health began to decline rapidly, her strength fading, and villagers noticed her once proud posture bend under invisible weight, until one night she fell seriously ill, calling out Michael's name repeatedly in her fever. And though some villagers pitied her, others believed she was facing the natural outcome of her choices. As Christmas came and went, Michael and his family stayed home, celebrating quietly, grateful simply to be alive. And although they missed the village traditions, they found peace in togetherness, learning that celebration did not depend on location, but on gratitude and love. Years passed and life continued to shape the Harris family in unexpected ways as Michael adapted to his wheelchair, learning new skills, mentoring others with disabilities, and becoming known for his kindness and wisdom. While Rebecca remained his steady support, her faith unwavering, and their children grew into thoughtful young people who respected prayer and understood humility. Michael never returned to the village during Christmas, choosing instead to build new traditions rooted in reflection and gratitude. But he never spoke with hatred about Margaret, believing forgiveness was part of his transformation, even though the pain of betrayal lingered quietly in his heart. Eventually, news reached him that Margaret had passed away after a long illness, and when he heard, Michael felt a mix of sorrow and release, because he knew her story was a reminder of how jealousy could destroy peace, and how harmful intentions often return to their source. After her passing, Michael felt a strong inner prompting to visit the village one last time, not out of pride or anger, but to make peace with the past. And when he finally returned years later, villagers welcomed him respectfully, many recalling the accident and his remarkable survival. And his presence carried humility rather than show, proving that hardship had refined his character rather than broken it. When Michael Harris returned from the village after his brief and humble visit years later, his heart felt heavier, yet clearer, because standing on those dusty roads again had reminded him how close he once came to losing everything, and how pride had nearly blinded him to warnings meant to save his life. And as he settled back into his daily routine at home, he became even more intentional about the way he lived, spoke, and guided his family, choosing patience over anger and faith over fear, because he understood now that survival was not just about breathing, but about purpose. Michael began receiving invitations from community groups, schools, and small gatherings where people asked him to share his story, not as entertainment, but as a lesson. And each time he spoke, he emphasized that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly through ignored warnings and mocked advice, and he made it clear that his wife Rebecca's prayers were not coincidence, but intervention. And as people listened, many were moved to reflect on their own lives, realizing how often they dismissed guidance simply because it challenged their comfort. At home, the Harris household grew stronger in unity, with prayer no longer being a duty, but a shared moment of gratitude. And the children, now older, began asking deeper questions about life, faith, and choices, understanding that success without humility could attract envy. And that wisdom meant staying alert, even in moments of joy. As time passed, Michael's story reached beyond his city, traveling through word of mouth and social circles, until one afternoon, he received a message from a man who claimed to have been one of the villagers during that tragic Christmas, explaining that strange events had continued long after the accident. Because the forest where the dark plans were made had reportedly become a place people avoided, as though nature itself rejected what had been done there. And hearing this did not bring Michael satisfaction, but sorrow, because it confirmed his belief that harmful intentions leave lasting damage not only to people, but to entire communities. Rebecca listened quietly as Michael shared the message, reminding him gently that forgiveness did not mean reopening wounds. And together they prayed not in anger, but in compassion, asking that peace would eventually return to the village and that future generations would choose better paths. Their children watched these moments closely, learning that strength was not proven by revenge or pride, but by restraint and kindness. And those lessons shaped the way they treated others at school and in friendships, making them known as respectful and thoughtful individuals. One year just before Christmas, Michael received another unexpected message, this time from Ruth Collins' daughter, who admitted that her mother had lived the rest of her life in fear and regret after those events, and that before her passing she had confessed everything, urging her children never to allow jealousy to guide their actions. And although this confession stirred old emotions, Michael felt a strange sense of closure, realizing that truth, even when delayed, still carries the power to heal. That Christmas, instead of sadness, the Harris family chose to celebrate with renewed gratitude, inviting neighbors, friends, and those who had no family nearby, turning their home into a place of warmth and unity, proving that joy grows when it is shared. And Rebecca smiled as she watched Michael lead a prayer not of fear, but of thankfulness, his voice steady and full of conviction. As the years continued, Michael became a mentor to younger men who struggled with arrogance or disbelief, patiently reminding them that ignoring wisdom often comes at a cost. And his wheelchair, once seen by others as a symbol of loss, became a symbol of survival and transformation, because it reminded everyone who met him that life could change in a single moment, yet still hold meaning and purpose. Rebecca, meanwhile, became a quiet source of strength for many women, teaching them that faith does not always produce immediate results, but it builds protection, layer by layer, unseen but powerful. And her calm presence reassured many that consistency and goodness is never wasted. Together, Michael and Rebecca demonstrated that marriage was not about perfection, but partnership, especially in moments when belief and doubt collided. One summer afternoon, one of Michael's sons asked him directly if he ever regretted taking that journey years ago, and Michael paused for a long moment before answering honestly, explaining that while he regretted ignoring warnings and mocking prayer, he did not regret the lesson itself, because it reshaped his life and saved his family. And he explained that sometimes consequences arrive not to destroy, but to redirect, and that wisdom is recognizing the difference. That conversation stayed with his children, shaping their choices as they grew into adulthood. Cautious not to dismiss advice simply because it came in unexpected forms, and mindful that not every smile hides goodwill. Years later, as Michael's hair turned grey and his children began families of their own, his story became something passed down, not as a tale of fear, but as a reminder of awareness, humility, and faith. And during family gatherings, especially around Christmas, someone would always ask him to tell it again. And each time he did, he focused less on the accident and more on the transformation, emphasizing that life is fragile and success should be carried gently. Rebecca often watched these moments quietly, her heart full, knowing that her prayers had not only protected her family physically, but had planted values that would outlive them. In his later years, Michael spent more time reflecting, often sitting by the window in the evenings, watching the sun set and thinking about how close darkness had once come, and how light had prevailed not through force, but through faith. And he understood deeply that warnings do not always come wrapped in comfort, and guidance does not always sound logical, but wisdom lies in listening before it is too late. He encouraged his grandchildren to pray, to remain humble, and to never allow jealousy to take root in their hearts, explaining that comparison steals peace and gratitude protects it. When Michael eventually passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family, there was no fear in the room, only gratitude, because his life had become a testimony of change, and Rebecca, though heartbroken, felt comforted knowing that the journey they almost never returned from had ultimately shaped generations. And as the family gathered afterward, they spoke not of tragedy, but of lessons learned, lives touched, and faith strengthened. And Michael Harris was remembered not as the man who ignored prayer, but as the man who learned, changed, and lived with purpose, proving that even the most painful warnings can become the greatest blessings when understood in time. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I hope it touched your heart and gave you something meaningful to think about. If you learned any lesson or felt inspired in any way, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means a lot. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss more powerful and inspiring stories like this. Until next time, stay safe, stay grateful, and keep believing. If you like this story, make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share with your friends and family so you don't miss the next powerful story coming your way. Drop a heart in comment, like and subscribe my channel, and visit my channel for more interesting story videos.